And on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Institute and the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales and the Australian Human Rights Commission, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Andrea Durbach. I'm a Professor Emeritus in the Faculty of Law and Justice and a very close associate of the Institute. And I'm also delighted to say that I had a term as the Deputy Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. So it's a very, very great honour to have Kate Jenkins, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, participating in this panel with us today. Today's panel will explore the findings and impact of the National Student Safety Survey of 2022, and it will focus particularly on the question of whether our efforts to address gender violence within university settings and university responses are indicating sufficient progress to this crisis, or are they indicating a systemic failure by universities to both address and prevent sexual violence? I want to welcome all of you and to acknowledge that we're participating in this event from unceded Aboriginal lands and acknowledge the custodians of these lands and pay my respect to elders both past and present. Before we hear from our panelists, I might just offer some background to the reason for this event. The issue of sexual assault and sexual harassment in university environments has been the subject of strong advocacy by students, unions, victim survivors, and sexual violence support services for many decades in this country. In 2015, the Australian Human Rights Centre, and now Institute, was commissioned by the Hunting Ground Australia project to undertake a major project on the extent, nature, and responses to sexual violence within university settings across Australia. And as part of what the project was called the Strengthening Australian University Responses to Sexual Assault and Harassment, the Centre invited the Australian Human Rights Commission to undertake a pilot survey to ascertain the prevalence of sexual assault and harassment at Australian universities. The peak body of Australian universities, University Australia, partnered with the Commission, making a significant contribution to ensure that the survey could be nationwide and cover all UA's 39 member universities. The Commission implemented this first national student survey in 2016, with 30,930 students from 39 universities participating. And the survey results were complemented by a further 1,849 qualitative submissions, to date the largest number of submissions ever received by a Commission inquiry. In August 2017, the Commission published Change the Course, the National Report on Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment at Australian universities, which detailed the Commission's findings from the national survey and from the qualitative submissions. The Human Rights Institute published a companion report called On Safe Ground, a good practice guide for Australian universities, which drew together the survey findings with comparative international research and analysis, and a hope to develop good practice frameworks for Australian universities. In response to these reports, many Australian universities and residential colleges began to take steps to address sexual violence. And I'm delighted to say that UNSW has been at the forefront of these efforts, with the backing of strong leadership from our former Vice-Chancellor Ian Jacobs and current Vice-Chancellor Attila Brungs. More recently, the Conduct and Integrity Office in the Division of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, led by Professor Eileen Baldry, has steered UNSW's efforts to ensure a safe culture for study and work, publishing its first annual report last year on the prevention of and response to sexual misconduct at UNSW. And this was the first university, UNSW was the first university to publish a report of this kind. Researchers associated with the Institute and with UNSW's Gendered Violence Research Network have built on the Centre's earlier work, while Kate Jenkins and the Sex Discrimination team at the Commission have since 2017 undertaken investigations into workplaces, sporting sectors, and the Australian Parliament. And now today's focus. In March 22, the results of the National Student Survey, commissioned by Universities Australia and designed and conducted by the Social Research Centre at ANU and Dr. Anastasia Powell of RMIT, were released. Unlike the 2022 survey, the 2016 survey was undertaken by an independent statutory authority, the Australian Human Rights Commission, as I've mentioned. And so it had arm's length, some distance, from the institutions under review, and critically also had the specialist expertise in conducting these sorts of complex national surveys on difficult and sensitive issues. In the opening paragraph of the Institute's report on Safe Ground, the former National Union of Students President and former UNSW SRC President Sophie Johnson said, and I quote, "It is much easier to focus on the success of an institution rather than its failures. However, it is honourable to be able to acknowledge that we have failed, but that we continue to refuse to fail on this matter." Close quotes. The release of the second 2022 National Student Survey report last month was met with a series of apologies from Universities Australia and from some VCs for exactly what Sophie Johnson declared universities cannot do, that is, fail on this issue. Almost 5 years after the very unsettling results of the first National Student Survey, and reports with both had very clear recommendations and good practice guides and action plans, the results of the second survey have given rise to admissions of failure across many universities on almost every aspect that was highlighted by the first survey: complaint processes, accountability, redress, and prevention. And furthermore, curiously, the second survey was not accompanied by any recommendations and no plan for what to do next. I'd like to start our discussion by inviting Kate Jenkins, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, to reflect on the National Survey of 2022. Kate, having had oversight of the first National Survey, could you tell us what your response was to the second survey? And in answering this, I wonder if you could look at whether you think the failure, which is acknowledged by the universities and by their leadership, is the consequence perhaps of a process, the second survey being quite different from the first in terms of its design and framing and implementation? Or have universities simply failed to pay sufficient attention to the recommendations arising from the first survey 5 years ago? Or is it both?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that great explanatory opening context setting as well. It's really important to understand and take heart from the work that's gone before, because it is so important that at the same time, recognising the failures, also recognising the progress as well. You might recall, it was this project of reviewing the 39 universities was the very first project I did when I was appointed as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, from the work that you had done, that the student leaders, that women and advocates had really set out, and also my predecessor doing the reviews of ADFA and looking at the experience of young people in that educational setting really encouraged. There was a weight of encouragement, and the movie The Hunting Ground and the global position really pushed towards getting change. And I guess I'm making that because in my closing remarks, I'll just remind you that this momentum for change, the push, the elephant pushing over the house, it still continues, and we must continue because we are absolutely demanding the change that we need to get. So if I think about back to the 2016 survey and the context you've set, it is significant that this was in a survey done in 2016 before the Harvey Weinstein kind of conversation. The results were produced in 2017, but notably the survey was done in 2016. Universities Australia told me that was the first time that the 39 universities had all done something together, and it's not to be underestimated. These are organisations that while they might be one industry, they can be highly competitive to each other. And so to bring them together and to say this is a uniform challenge and you need to come together is really important, and it remains important. At the time, and you know this, Andy, well, people said, why are you focusing on universities? To me, there was this sense of, isn't this a privileged cohort, and aren't there other things that you should be focusing on? And I'll just remind you, and I'm sure this audience understands why, but at that point in time, I know 5% of the Australian population was enrolled in a university. It was the place that particularly young people who we know are at higher risk of sexual violence were together. And it was also a place where our future leaders are being developed, as well as a place that almost everyone has a connection to, whether you've been to university, whether you have a child that's looking to go to university, whether a family member, whether you've got a grandchild. So the connections into our community were critical. And Andy, as you recall, your report and ours in combination really gave a sense of the way forward. And one of the recommendations, recommendation 8, was that there be surveys conducted at 3 yearly intervals. We did consider that quite closely, that interval, and the sense was 3 years is the average undergraduate degree. And so you would have an entire new generation, even though people talk about generations as 20 years, a whole new cohort by 3 years, and we would have hoped that in 3 years that new cohort would have a different experience. So my just headline, and I'm looking forward to hearing the panel, my headline reflections on the survey that came out. My starting point is it's fantastic it was done. There's a couple of disappointments that of which nothing can be done about. One of them was we did recommend 3 years for a reason, to do a survey and then take 5 years to discover that actually we haven't had the significant change is just such a wasted opportunity. We would have wanted to know that 2 years ago. And a lot of the explanation now that's given on the results is, well, this could be because of COVID. Well, the 3-year cycle would have had this done before COVID. So I'm not hiding that I'm disappointed, and I think there's compounding reasons why then that delay was added to. The other is, I think for the universities, it is really disappointing that they modified the data points so much that there is actually no comparable data. So in terms of, there was a sense, and I may be being unkind here, but there was a sense of great enthusiasm and expertise towards doing the survey, but more of a focus on the survey than in fact what is the main game, which is the change that's needed and the work in workplaces. So there will be good explanations on why different data points have changed, but for a university that has now got results that have told them that there is still concerns in there, there's not the comparable data points for them to have the evidence that they probably would have benefited from if they had been the same. Put those things to one side, though, incredibly valuable to have this survey. And I guess the next disappointment, which is the one that is actually also the opportunity, is that the results, notwithstanding those changes, showed us that despite those changes, overall, the trends consistently show that we haven't had the change that we would have hoped for. In particular, the survey told us that young women and gender and sexuality diverse students continue to experience higher rates of sexual harassment, that perpetrators show up primarily men, and in terms of the locations, those localised contexts at universities, residential colleges, social locations are still places of high rates of sexual harassment. There is a difference in witnessing. Fewer people had witnessed, but there's no question that COVID has had a role. COVID being people being remote, but also social distancing. So really removing some of those opportunities for one-on-one contact. So those are sort of some of the high-level observations. I'm happy in the closing remarks to give some views on what are the opportunities going forward, but I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation of the panel and really just handing this over with that sense of it is still incredibly valuable. And there's no question that I would urge universities that you've now got this. It is time for the next stage of driving the change that we need. And even if the evidence shows us that we haven't had the change, that is evidence and information we needed as well. So they can't continue to, naively say we're doing things, because there's no question that there's been loud leadership and there has been a lot of activity. But what are those things that have worked and what are the things that need to change? So I'll hand back to you, Andy, and look forward to hearing the panel speak.
Thank you, Kate, for those. Thank you for reminding me to switch on. But thank you also for your very acute and insightful observations about this opportunity that the survey presented, which we will unpack further in the discussion, but also your suggestion we're looking forward to of ways forward, which we'll return to later in the discussion. I want to move now to our panelists, and we've chosen our panelists particularly because they are all students in some form or another, at some point or another along the student spectrum at UNSW. And they are the intended beneficiaries of this work. And so we wanted to hear their perspectives from their different positions along that spectrum of being a student, to inform us about their response to the survey, but also to take us beyond the survey into what still needs to happen. And we're very, very thrilled to first welcome Adel, who is a law arts student at this university and the Student Representative Council Women's Officer currently. And she will reflect on the student survey process and the findings from the perspective of a university women's officer. So thank you so much, Aya. I know what Kate's mentioned is that COVID was a factor, but it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective of what was happening on the ground at the time of the survey. Were students aware of the previous survey? Were they aware of the current? Was it something that mobilized students around the issue of sexual violence? Over to you.
Thank you, Andy. And before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you to Kate for those incredible insights. It's going to be pretty hard to follow on from her. But yeah, I appreciate you inviting me to this panel today. As you have said, this is a very important survey that was conducted. It's very important that it has been released, albeit a little bit late. But I'm very pleased, and I think the UNSW's student body is very pleased that we do have a survey we can look towards now, something kind of concrete with some data. With regards to the data itself, I recall at the time last year as a student in September that there was a bit of hush about it. There were a bit of chatter between students about the survey, and that a few students did know about it. I think the majority, though, didn't. And I think that's a bit of an issue. It was most certainly aimed at the people who it would be affecting the most. So as we've seen, this would be young women, this would be young Indigenous women, young women of queer backgrounds. So these are the people that the survey definitely did target. And as a result, those are the people that were made aware of the survey at the time. However, as we all know, sexual discrimination doesn't just affect these categories, it affects everyone, really. So I think a failing of the survey in terms of acknowledging it is that at the time, a lot of these other categories of people, for example, cisgendered males, weren't made aware that this survey was even being conducted. I think if that had been the case, if they were made aware of the survey, it would have been a bit of some maybe different results, because I'm sure they also have stories to share and stories to tell, if not from what they've seen or what they've heard from their own experiences on campus. So that's kind of what it was like on the ground for us in September of last year. I will say that I personally wasn't made aware of it until I took a more activist role in my university. So I would venture to say that the average university student wasn't necessarily aware that this survey was being conducted at that time. However, it was very clear to us as students, especially as female students, that something was being conducted in some sort. We did know that the universities were looking at sexual assault on campus. This was a conversation that was ongoing throughout the entirety of last year. And I think one thing that this survey did do very well was prompt that conversation. as I've said, even before the survey results came out this year, last year when the survey was being conducted, it prompted that conversation of sexual assault and sexual discrimination on campus. As a result, throughout my entire year last year, I was a first year student, so this was my first year experiencing university. I very much had sexual discrimination on the forefront of my mind as an issue that was very topical at the time for me, and I think for my peers as well. So the survey was very successful in mobilizing these students, and I think any survey with regards to this issue is very, very important to getting student awareness up, because with awareness and greater awareness about the issue, we're able to instigate greater change, and we're able to get these young student leaders fired up about these issues that are still being talked about, despite another report being released in 2018 and very little change between the two, really. It is these surveys that allow us to get angry about it and to then, look to the university for some sort of change. So yeah, while there wasn't too much knowledge of it at the time, I think now that it's come out, it has had a brilliant effect on students. I know personally, I've had so much more interest in the UNSW Women's Collective since the survey has come out, with lots of students coming to me and asking how they can get involved in changing a lot of these issues. And I think one thing that really became prominent, as I said, was that the survey targeted or showed how much sexual discrimination affects certain groups. And this was something that I think hadn't quite been highlighted before. So it really showed the intersectionality of the topic of sexual discrimination. And that was something I think, we've always known that sexual discrimination occurs, but we didn't quite know the intersectionality of it until now. And I think, students have felt very much rewarded by this and very grateful that the survey has shown us this. That's pretty much all I have to say on it, but I'm very, very fond of the survey having come out, and I'm really looking forward to mobilizing some more students that are passionate about it to get some change going.
Well, we look forward to you doing that, and we'll be helping you all along the way, but that's a very important comment you make and comments you make, but a significant one being about the different categories of students that need to be more integrated in and to be recognized and acknowledged that this is not just something that happens to women, although primarily that is where it's taking place, but to recognize the diversity of student experience and to mobilize students around a survey, I think is a really important point you make. So thank you, Aya. Can I remind all our participants too to please, if you have comments or questions, to add them to the Q&A function in the Zoom, not the chat function, but there is a Q&A function. We're now going to move on to a former UNSW women's officer, Ange Griffin, who was the women's officer in 2018, but then also the SRC president in 2019, and worked with me and my colleagues very much on the Safe Ground report, on getting it out and getting it implemented, which of course, as Kate says, was the companion report to the Commission's one on Safe Ground. The difference with our report was that it actually put forward a framework around which we thought universities could develop good practice, but also had a comparative dimension to it. So we looked at the work of universities similar to Australian universities in different contexts like Canada, South Africa, America, and drew some kind of important recommendations and insights from their work as well. But Ange has gone on then to work on the subject as an honours student with the School of Social Science at UNSW, and has also worked with the Gender Violence Research Network. And I'm keen to ask you, Angela, about student engagement in university responses. We and the Commission were very, very keen to ensure that as I said, the intended beneficiaries of this work, students, were engaged both at the point of design of any policies or practices or complaints processes, but also in the implementation and the enhancement and evaluation of those practices. And so we wanted students to be brought onto committees, to be integrated very much with university leadership in the design of prevention mechanisms, but also redress mechanisms. And I wonder if you could speak a little to your research and your honours work, Ange, about whether that goal of student engagement has been met, or was it merely something that universities paid lip service to?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so as Andy sort of outlined a bit there, I completed my honours project last year. And as part of that, I kind of looked into the Human Rights Commission's report came out in 2017. And I felt like last year, there really hadn't been much sort of looking into whether the universities had actually implemented the recommendations that were outlined in that report. And I felt like it was really important to look into that. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to speak with student activists about whether they felt that their universities had implemented things correctly, or if they felt it had dropped off. And one of the key things that I found, so I received 12 qualitative submissions from current and previous student activists, student women's officers, and similar. And one of the most interesting things that I found was that although there was varying degrees of satisfaction with involvement in the immediate years following the release of the Change the Course report, student activists were really involved in working groups and in committees. Recommendation 1 of the report, which I felt underpinned all of the other recommendations, was that students must be included in groups basically that were making decisions. And in the years following, students did feel like they were being involved. And although there was a bit of difference between how students felt the effectiveness of this involvement was, they did feel like they were being involved. But what I found when I spoke with students that were more recently involved, there was very little awareness of what the universities had done, because universities had sort of stopped engaging with students as regularly. And I think as well, those committees and working groups that were set up in the immediate aftermath of the Change the Course report, a lot of them had been quietly discontinued or had students removed from the group. And I think like partially that was spoken about as a result of COVID-19 and changes in funding. But I feel like that's not a good enough excuse. This is such an important issue, and it happened before COVID, and we now know it happened during COVID as well. So it's really important that these committees and these decision-making groups are continue to be resourced regardless of what is happening in the world more broadly. And also, I think it's really important that students are continued to be involved, and it's really important that they are embedded in the process. I think what I found was that students had to fight really hard in those early stages to be involved. And in the following years, due to COVID and a number of other reasons, students weren't able to fight quite as hard to get that spot on the committees. And because of that, student places sort of began to drop off. And I think students shouldn't have to be fighting that hard to get a seat at the table. It should be embedded in the processes from the very beginning. So I'm hoping that the National Student Safety Survey will kickstart that process again and make sure that these committees are reset up and students are put on them again. But I do think it's concerning, as Kate sort of mentioned already, that there were no recommendations as part of the final report for this survey. So I think it's up to individual universities to make sure that that is actually being done. Yeah. You're on mute, Andy.
Two really important, thank you, Ange, and two really, really important factors that universities can hear, I hope, and that is that consistent effort must be made to ensure student integration in those committees and in those design processes. So thank you for that. And whatever the circumstances, we need to make sure that that happens. But I think also the point you make about recommendations, that it would have, in my view, been very useful to have a comparison on where we've come with the recommendations that the Commission recommended and where we're at now. And I know there've been audit processes of the universities by the Commission, but people don't necessarily see those. It's a survey like this that actually makes people aware again, because it's such a big initiative that happens. And we need to make sure that those recommendations can be tracked through a survey as well. So I want to now move on away from the student engagement to actually the universities as responders to this, this conduct, and ask Allison Henry, who was a very key person involved in the Hunting Ground project and the implementation of that film, the dissemination of that film across university campuses, but also worked very closely with the Human Rights Centre in the development of our report on safe ground. And Ali has now taken that work into her doctoral thesis. She's now a PhD candidate at UNSW, where she's focusing on the institutional responses to sexual misconduct on university settings, but focus very much on the internal processes by universities and also the external processes. We've heard that many of the VCs in response to this recent national survey came out and apologized for the failure of institutions to do, that we're still in this situation and to do more perhaps than they could have done. But really, we can't accept failure as a form of accountability. It is not sufficient. And we've had reviews and apologies taking the place of accountability mechanisms and thinking that that is sufficient. That's all universities need to do. And Ali, I hope you will address whether much more is needed beyond simply endless reports, reviews, and now the phenomenon of the apology. Over to you.
Thanks, Andy. So as Kate and Ange in particular have been talking about, there was a flurry of activity obviously after the 2017 report and the change the course, just 2017 survey and the change the course and on safe ground reports. But then of course the second survey got delayed. We were looking at what was happening in terms of many of the participants in the survey were locked down. They hadn't been on campus for a few years. There'd just been a sort of a slowdown that Kate and Ange have been talking about. In these circumstances, it wasn't overly surprising that some of the results came out the way they did, that more than half of the students that participated in the survey said that they knew very little or nothing about what their university's sexual assault or sexual harassment policies were, and that about the same number really had no idea where to go for help if they had experienced some sort of incident. So I think first up, I think that suggests that universities, as has already been talked about a little bit, maybe have dropped the ball a little bit in the last couple of years in terms of communicating with their students. And obviously by not having the students involved in some of these processes, whatever communication that is happening is not necessarily getting through. So I think there's some of the things to think about straight up. In terms of why students didn't make complaints, it was very similar reasons were offered in this second survey that were offered in the first survey, which that in common that with that first survey, they said that they felt embarrassed or frightened, thinking they did not need the help, or that they didn't want people to know about the incident that had happened. But they also pointed out to sort of more structural and systemic issues, that they expressed concerns that others would think that the incident was not serious enough, that it'd be too hard to prove, that they wouldn't be believed, or that there would be some impact if they reported an incident, there'd be some impact on their own studies. The second student survey revealed that a really tiny proportion of students, like a really minuscule proportion of students experiencing sexual violence, actually reported to their institutions, which is a concern in itself, given all the work that's been going on. But then on top of that, only 29% of those that did report sexual assault and only 41% of those that reported sexual harassment were satisfied with the way that the universities dealt with those issues. Submissions to the survey highlighted students' frustration with the lack of transparency around what the reporting avenues were, and particularly around disciplinary action. And a note here that UNSW is one of the few universities in Australia that actually makes its complaints and disciplinary data available. And that means that students can see how matters are investigated, how long they take, and what sort of outcomes and disciplinary procedures might actually come from those investigations. As we've been talking about, universities have been offered any number of good practice guides over the last few years that have been offered as a way to help bring up better handling of complaints and associated matters. But universities, as Kate mentioned, are large, often competing, self-regulating institutions. And there's actually no mechanism currently in place where all that good practice that has been offered is actually drawn into the university response. There's nothing that compels unis to draw on that expertise when they're designing their actual processes and procedures. And I think part of all the work I've been doing in my PhD is looking at the absence of effective external accountability mechanisms, which I think have compounded this problem. Universities generally don't like being told what to do. They're large institutions, they run large budgets, often they have tens of thousands of students and staff, and they like to run their own show. Universities Australia, the peak body, have adopted a very in-house approach to dealing with sexual violence and have really taken the view that it is a matter for the sector itself and for universities to deal with this issue unencumbered by external oversight. Governments have pretty much acquiesced to this as well. We've had a string of federal education ministers since the last survey, and they have repeatedly directed students and advocates to TEQSA, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency. As their name implies, TEQSA are usually tasked with registering providers and accrediting courses provided by those institutions. They have very little in-house, if any, in-house expertise in sexual violence. Since 2017, TEQSA has treated sexual violence in higher education as a sector-wide issue, and they have taken a number of different approaches to trying to support the sector in how they manage these issues. Today, I just want to focus on one aspect of that, which is their complaints handling, which I've been tracking through Senate estimates processes through for the last 4 or 5 years as part of my research. So TEQSA never used to have complaints processes, but after they received an initial test complaint from the group NRAC on campus in September 2017, they decided to start accepting complaints in order to get a sense of what universities were doing on the ground. These complaints are generally situations where students have exhausted all of their processes at their own university, and then they've sought redress from TEQSA, gone to TEQSA and sought some help because they feel that it hasn't been handled properly, which is what we've seen through the second survey. TEQSA, when they're looking at these complaints, they don't re-prosecute the actual investigation, but rather they look at the way that a higher education provider, like a university, has dealt with an allegation of sexual assault or sexual harassment, and whether that provider has been compliant with the threshold standards, which are the legislated standards that all higher education providers must comply with. Between September 2017 and February 2022, TEQSA received 31 of these complaints, and 21 of those have been finalised. Most of those that have been finalised have been in relation to universities. In not one of those cases has TEQSA found a reason to take any regulatory action. They've reportedly on occasion found breaches of 1 or 2 aspects of a university's policies, but when I actually sent some questions to them as part of my PhD, they told me, and I quote, that they have not found it necessary to impose conditions, limit registration periods, or take civil or criminal action on the basis of a university's response to sexual assault or sexual harassment. The strongest sanction applied by TEQSA has been monitoring and annual reporting of several universities. So in effect, this means that students report to their university, and as we've seen through the second student survey, many of them are unhappy with the way that the university handles that complaint. Then they have an unsatisfactory response and they go to TEQSA, the national regulator. And often then, after a very prolonged investigation, because many of these investigations with TEQSA seem to take months and months and months, TEQSA tells them nothing to see here. Universities in turn say, TEQSA investigated us and everything's okay. They said everything's okay, so there's nothing to see here. Because there's no regulatory action taken by TEQSA, nothing is publicly recorded in TEQSA's National Register, which is on their website. That means that students, staff, parents, the general public, governments, no one has any idea which universities in Australia have been repeatedly investigated for their handling of sexual violence matters, and nothing changes. Which is why now, 5 years later, after an enormous amount of effort, a whole bunch of activity, and a lot of goodwill, it's fair to say, we have the findings of the second survey, which suggests that students are no more confident in their processes today than they were in 2016, which to me is a really systemic failure. And I think we really need to look at how we can actually address that and making sure that universities are implementing good practice and are learning some lessons along the way, because at the moment, we're really, really worried from what's come out of this second survey that maybe those lessons have been missed.
Wow, a very sobering reflection, Ali. Thank you so much. There's a lot to chew through from your observations, from your research. And I wonder if in the Q&A you might consider coming back to a question around, do you think, given the failure of the internal and now, as you say, the external processes to a large degree, that students more and more are being forced to look at other perhaps litigious routes against universities, as has been the case in America? Be interested to hear your reflections on that, because that would be a pretty devastating message for students to know that the only route they really have is to take legal action, which is both expensive and protracted and doubly traumatic. So let me then move, thank you again, Ali, to our final panelist from the student perspective, and that is Anna Hush, who is very nicely positioned to speak about if universities are failing through their processes and practices, is there something more perhaps invisible that needs to happen? Namely, the culture of universities needs to shift dramatically. Is that possible? I want to go back to something that Kate said about universities being the site of shaping our future leaders. And if we're not giving them students the skills and the norms and the values to take out into the world, then we're lacking there as well in shaping what is something that is very, very worrying happening on our campuses, not in terms just of the conduct, but in terms of people's attitudes, students' attitudes to one another and to the issue of sexual assault and harassment. Anna was the 2016 Women's Officer at the University of Sydney SRC and is now a doctoral candidate at UNSW within the Australian Human Rights Institute, where she's looking specifically at sexual violence and cultural change in the context of the Australian neoliberal university. And she will offer some reflections, as I mentioned, on the sort of normative dimension of the university in sexual violence prevention. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you to the Human Rights Institute for the invitation to speak. I'm calling in from Gadigal land today, and I just want to pay my respect to the traditional owners of this land over which sovereignty was never ceded. So I think, like many of the panelists today, when I was reading the recent National Student Safety Survey report, and I guess reading it kind of against the backdrop of the Change the Course report released by the Commission in 2017, I was sort of struck more than anything by the similarities of the figures in the reports, by the stories that were presented, in the qualitative report, and by the sort of avenues for continued action, which are presented in lieu of recommendations in the recent report. Which, as Andy and Ange have noted, provide very little in the way of a concrete plan, but nevertheless, I think still point to, what still needs to be done in the presence of this kind of continued failure of universities to take concrete actions to respond to sexual violence. And I think given this similarity, it's worth asking what function this new report plays, aside from confirming what we all already knew, which is that sexual violence is widespread at universities and that institutional responses to this violence are, by and large, either absent, inappropriate, or ineffective. And I think it's, important to acknowledge that these reports can sort of serve multiple and contradictory functions at once. They can be both spaces for survivors' voices and testimonies. And in that regard, as Kate mentioned at the start, I think they're, a really important achievement of advocates and activists and all the work that students and staff have done over the years. But at the same time, I think these reports can also serve as opportunities for universities' self-promotion and for the diffusion of political pressure that's built up to call for cultural and structural change at universities. I think this first function of documenting survivors' testimonies is extremely important, and I think it's to give credit to the researchers that worked on this report. I think it's reflected in the design and the methodology of the National Student Safety Survey, and especially its qualitative component. But I think what I want to think about today is the second and I guess more kind of insidious function of these reports, which is how students' experiences of harm and of injustice or can be strategically leveraged by universities in order for them to kind of brand themselves as proactive, progressive, and benevolent institutions. And just to give a bit of history, I think this kind of dynamic isn't unique to the two reports that have been funded by Universities Australia in 2017 and recently. So in 2016, the University of Sydney commissioned a report from former Sex Discrimination Commissioner Elizabeth Broderick, investigating the university's residential colleges. And in the introduction to this report, Broderick wrote, and I'm quoting here, that the findings in this report should in no way reduce the confidence of the community in the residential colleges. Rather, this and the individual colleges reports serve as a record that the colleges are genuinely committed to cultural renewal. And in the wake of this report, the colleges took the opportunity to congratulate themselves on their bravery and their commitment in participating in the investigation, even when some of them had refused to do so in the first place and sort of been dragged there kicking and screaming. So this kind of investigation that initially presented a major reputational threat to the colleges eventually became an opportunity for them to rebrand themselves as modern, even feminist institutions. Likewise, universities' statements in response to the recent National Student Safety Survey were quite predictable and formulaic. A lot of them called the report difficult reading. A lot of them repeated the now very tired line that they have zero tolerance for sexual violence. And they also, I think, had quite an interesting tension, which was, on the one hand, apologising for their failure over the past few years to enact the recommendations of the first report, but on the other hand, trying to showcase all the initiatives that they'd undertaken, as ineffective as they may be. So I think this is how a report highlighting problems becomes their resolution, to borrow the words of UK gender studies scholars Alison Phipps and Liz McDonnell. In other words, the very act of participating in an investigation, even one funded by the representative body for vice-chancellors, becomes construed as a form of action in and of itself. And I think this is how, as Kate noted in her opening remarks, this kind of focus on the data that we need and the process of conducting investigations can detract attention and resources from the sort of concrete changes that are required. So as part of my PhD research, I interviewed, like Angela, I interviewed student activists who'd been involved in agitating for change around campus sexual violence before and after the Australian Human Rights Commission's report was released in 2017. And the students that I interviewed described how, after the release of the Change the Course report, a lot of the momentum that had built up behind these student campaigns actually waned. Universities' kind of grand statements about their commitments to action and the 800 actions that they'd already taken, as Universities Australia continues to tout this figure of 800 actions. This had all successfully diffused the political pressure that had been built up by decades of activism led by students and survivors. And the sort of finer details about what universities were actually doing were increasingly opaque and inaccessible and caught up in the kind of slow workings of university bureaucracies and committees and so on. And I think we need to be clear that this isn't really an anomaly. This is, in many senses, this is business as usual for the neoliberal university. To kind of stave off these reputational threats with quite sophisticated PR strategies in order to stand out in a quite sort of crowded and homogenous higher education sector to attract new students and their fees. And I think we can see in a lot of other instances as well, like in universities' campaigns around racism, how these kind of grassroots social justice campaigns are taken up into this sort of diversity and inclusion complex. And in many cases, they're turned into these sort of glossy poster campaigns that do very little, aside from sort of furthering the branding of individual universities. So, I think if this is business as usual, then what is needed is to disrupt that. And for, I think student activists who have a critical role to play here, to make some bolder demands, not just for consultation, as important as it is, but which ultimately the outcome of which remains in the hands of university executives, but instead for structural transformation and for a reshaping of the kind of power relations that constitute contemporary universities between staff and students, between different groups of students, and particularly the power held by university managers and executives. And I think, these demands also need to be backed up by tactics that pose a real threat to universities. And I think, there's been petitions, there've been demonstrations, and I think it's time for students to think about, what is required in order to create the kind of transformative changes that are needed to tackle sexual violence, rather than sort of tinkering with policy wording or, tinkering with a module here and there. And I think that stronger links between student and staff unions is really important in this, as well as closer analysis of the links between sexual violence and other forms of harm and exploitation within the neoliberal university. I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
Hey, brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. For I think a very important critique of the university and its response to these sorts of surveys. And I think that the sort of underlying authenticity that may be lacking in much of this work that students are crying out for. And how do we get that authenticity back in the way universities can respond and actually contribute to the cultural change that's so necessary? Before we move on to questions and answers and comments, and I see there are some questions, so thank you. Kate, I'm going to ask you please to just wrap up the panel discussion, and thank you again to all our panelists. Having heard what you've just heard, your work of course goes much broader than universities, even though they're critical. We've heard that universities, as Ali has mentioned, are somewhat removed from the churches, the judiciary, the defence force, Parliament, other sites where this sort of activity is regrettably being noted. How do universities get beyond this sort of notion of being, we're there looking after our students' well-being, there's the pastoral care dimension of what we do, so it's fine, leave it to ourselves, we can deal with this, we can redress this, as beyond just the kind of rhetoric of zero tolerance and respect now always. And then just finally, do you think that the time has now come, as one of the recommendations from the On Safe Ground report was pushing for, was that there needs to be some external monitoring body that looks at universities, or generally this issue across all institutions?
Thank you, Andy. And I know I'll just whip through a few comments, because I also do want to make sure we've got time to answer those questions. So I'll just make a couple of broad comments. Firstly, in great awe for all the speakers that have gone before me. It really invigorates me, and those real truths that you have spoken are the ones that need to be heard. So I hope, and I plan on sharing this recording with as many people within universities as I can. So thank you to everyone. Just the context since the last survey that we did, both not just at the Commission, but broader conversations, including about sexual assault of school students. Chanel Contos is sort of the centre of that, but she's not the only one. And as you've already mentioned, reviews in Parliament, our Respect at Work inquiry, in mining, in gymnastics. This issue is now a national conversation. It's a subject of our election campaigns, that there is momentum more broadly. And I think we need to know that both there is the momentum, but also a lot more expertise than existed in 2017 on what might work. So if I think in terms of the idea of that monitoring and oversight, I'm supportive of that idea. The reality is we support self-regulation if it works, but if it hasn't worked, then you look beyond that. I just had on reflection sort of the go forward. There were 4 things, and then underneath this, I would say the student engagement point, which was such an important point when we did the work in 2017 that Angela spoke about, is just underpins all of this. So my main encouragement for the universities is, because I'm echoing what was said by everyone else, the speech after by by various people after the release of this report was déjà vu as far as I was concerned. It was the same speech, I think. It felt like it anyway, and that I think reflects those results. So the 4 positive things I would really strongly encourage universities on. One is we need to continue to see strong and committed leadership. You can't lose focus on this. You can't put this off to a side committee and get on with your other priorities. It needs to be a priority. It needs to be a focus. Second, and most important, is the use of the evidence and the data. You need to do surveys, yes, but you need to get granular. These are universities. You should be able to look at what you've learned and continually change. You need to do this faster than 3 years, and I would say each university needs to do that. But the third is you also need to share across the industry. One of the main recommendations of Respect at Work, looking at prevention and response, was that industry action works. You've got the same drivers. They need to work together more strongly. Universities struggle with that, but that's most important. And the last thing that's been covered by others is you need to really understand the impact of gender and intersectionality, and that really doesn't seem to have changed at all. And you need to be acting on that. So those are some of the thoughts. The consistent and collaborative effort is kind of an overarching of all of those things. But I'll hand back to you, Andy, because I know we haven't got much time for questions, but look, the other speakers, thank you. Thank you for such wisdom.
Thank you so much, Kate, for some lovely pointers that take us into the next phase of this work, I hope, and highlight where we really need to focus. And one of the questions coming from Heather Clark actually speaks about the fact that the 2022 survey report didn't include recommendations for future action. And so her question is, do we need a part 2 of On Safe Ground, or indeed Change the Course, which both had recommendations? Or is it part of UA's brief to continue to guide and monitor that action to prevent and address sexual violence undertaken by the 39, well, happening at the 39 members? So Kate and Ali, maybe, and anybody else, what's your view on, do we need to hone in maybe on those recommendations and see where we're up to on them and perhaps build on them, given the recent survey?
I agree with that there are the lessons learned, and I know the work that we do with defence, you get the results, but then it's what are you going to do with this? Who should do that is the question, and I'll be interested in Ali's view. But I think that the delivery of this, after I'd got over my, disappointment at the things that I mentioned, was okay, but you're still 5 years ahead of most other industries. You've still got 2 surveys. What are you going to do with this? How are you going to work together? And I think if they just go back to their own kind of locations and, lament that what they'd done didn't work, that will just be failing our students. And so we need to say, whether it's through Universities Australia, whether it's through student activism or whoever, that there is a bit of clarity and expertise on what should happen next, and not just, we'll do the next survey and we'll all, have the same speech again.
Okay, thank you. Ali, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think what Kate said about, if self-regulation works, it works, but I think we can plainly see that it's not working here. And I think that means that we need to have some sort of external oversight body that actually has the expertise, which everyone agrees TEXA doesn't have, and TEXA pretty much admits they don't have, to look at sexual violence in universities and to really, I don't think we need a second volume 2 of On Safe Ground or anything like that. I think there's a lot of good practice that's out there. The problem at the moment is we don't know if the universities are actually implementing it. We've got no way of actually checking that. And while there have been some reviews into what university responses were to the Change the Course recommendations, they were largely universities self-reporting. And there's a reason why we don't get students to mark their own homework. You don't have that same sort of robust oversight mechanism. And there's been no resources put into this. It was incredibly hard for the Commission, I know, to do the 4 audits that it did. TEXA didn't have any additional funding, or had a little bit of additional funding for some of the work they've done in the sexual violence space. the governments are able to put extra funding into disciplinary procedures and contract treating and all these other things and task force that are set up for other areas of university life. And I think it's really important that we need to have some sort of mechanism that actually means that we take the good practice we've already got and actually implement it, make sure that universities are using it.
Do any of the other panelists wish to comment on that question?
Yeah, I do. So I did obviously my honours project last year, and as part of that, just for my own research reasons, I did a bit of an audit of like what all of the universities, I sort of focused on New South Wales, had done to respond to the recommendations of the Change the Course report. And something that I found was it was just really enormously difficult to find out if they'd done anything. I think universities, for the most part, have done some things, but it is completely hidden on university websites. And so I think it's not good enough to just be doing things. You all have to be transparent with your community about what it is that you're doing and also what it is that you're not doing. Because I think there's still a lot that needs to be done, but there isn't truthfulness currently in the industry around, what's being done and what's not being done.
Thanks, Ange. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very aware that we're at time, and I do want to just mention 2 points that are raised by our second and third questions, which are, I think, very fundamental and worrying. And that is, Camille Shuffle asks, how can we address the constant defamation claims by university institutions and managers who take action against victim survivors and their supporters who speak up, which is a very worrying phenomenon. I know it's probably more apparent in the United States, but this notion of protecting institutional reputation and limiting institutional liability, how comfortably does that sit with the assertion by universities about the well-being and protecting the well-being and safety of their students? It seems to be there's a tension between the action of bringing these defamation actions, which I'm not hugely aware of, thank goodness, but I know some of them are out there. But also to go to Emma Golledge's point about the request for disclosure agreements, non-disclosure agreements when people reach settlements around these issues, and the lack of transparency, so that if this stuff goes behind closed doors, if the deterrence aspect isn't made visible of holding people to account, we're losing a huge opportunity. And so I worry about just how universities are complicit in the silencing of students when these sorts of mechanisms are used against them, when they assert violent conduct towards them. So we can't answer those. My apologies, Camille and Emma, but thank you so much for raising them, because they are critical issues that universities, and I would like to add, Kate, to your 4 points. If the 5th point is about the complicity of universities, the mechanisms they rely on and are advised to take by lawyers and others, when in fact, on the other hand, they are supposedly there to exercise pastoral care and diminish harm to students, not exacerbate harm to students. And these 2 mechanisms are definitely exacerbators of harm. Can I thank all our amazing panelists? Really, UNSW, you have voices here that you should be using in devising your next framework or practices or policies. They're an amazing resource for you to use. So please, these students that we brought together today are there for you to tap and to bring on board in whatever way you can to actually address this horrendous crisis that universities are still unfortunately facing. Thank you all for coming to today's event. Thank you to all our panelists, and particularly to Drew Sheldrick and Ali Henry, who brought this thing together and managed it so brilliantly. And finally, to our Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, for all your extraordinary work, Kate, and all power to you for the next term. Okay. Thank you all, and good afternoon.